an honor for me to introduce our Member of Parliament, Elizabeth May. Increasing public involvement in municipal affairs was one of the 4 priorities chosen by Community Association members for attention this past year. We continue to address it in various ways. The municipal election this fall is another of our priorities, with a nonpartisan focus on providing information and working to increase voter turnout from 43% last time. Thinking of an AGM speaker, we realized we have one of Canada's most respected parliamentarians as our MP. Elizabeth has written extensively on all aspects of democracy and public engagement. Most recently, as a contributor to Turning Parliament Inside Out, Practical Ideas for Reforming Canada's Democracy. The book is described as a collaboration between MPs from all of Canada's major political parties, representing ridings from all across the country. They joined together in an across-the-aisle effort to make these changes a reality, explaining why reform is so urgently needed and proposing practical, achievable suggestions for making it happen. This cross-partisan cooperative project is aimed at increasing citizen control of Canada's political institutions. I had not read this one, but was blown away when I read her 2009 book, Losing Confidence: Power Politics and the Crisis in Canadian Democracy. I don't want to take up any more time, so I'll turn the mic over to Elizabeth. Please welcome her.
I really am honored to be here today. Some of you will know I owe Jocelyn a great deal. She's a powerhouse. She puts her mind to something, organizing in a community with gracious understatement and total modesty at all times. She's just someone I totally love and respect. So there would be no question that I would come to anything she invited me to. But a Sydney Community Association, you start with the creakiness of it. I'll try to get it right and I won't touch it again. It's really critical to our democracy that community associations exist. It's really such a wonderful thing to see the Sydney Community Association come into being. I was speaking, I guess, day before yesterday to the Cordova Bay Community Leadership Association. They're doing wonderful work. Everywhere you look in Sandwich Gulf Islands, there are community associations, some of long-standing and some springing up. I was riding on the Tour des Îles yesterday with the chair of that board, Kurt Firestone, and with his other, I don't know how they manage, volunteers are gold in society. So Kurt, in addition to being chair of the board of the Tour des Îles, is also playing a role in starting up a community association on Salt Spring, looking at community health and plugging into what we have throughout BC. There are a lot of rural health community associations. So the role of volunteers in working on issues, whether when I first started up the community roundtable on affordable housing, and a lot of you participated in that, community volunteers can come up with solutions that can stymie governments, because the source to a lot of the solutions we need in society are in thinking in a cross-jurisdictional and nonpartisan fashion. And that's, of course, I'm going to be completely nonpartisan today and just talk about what democracy needs in terms of citizen engagement to really, truly meet the standards of health. And when Jocelyn says that in the last municipal election, 43% voter turnout, compared to most Canadian communities, that's awesome. I hate to tell you. Turnout in municipal elections is historically 30% or lower. I think the election in which Naheed Nenshi was elected in Calgary, and I should have double-checked this, but I think it was in the low 20s in terms of voter turnout. Now, he would hold on to that seat, I imagine, with higher voter turnout. Sandwich Gulf Islands as a federal district, which I represent, and I'm so honored to represent this community in Ottawa. When I was elected in 2011, we had the highest voter turnout of, and I like to say and I don't want to say of normal-sized ridings, because that's, of course, insulting to Prince Edward Island. Prince Edward Island has amazing voter turnout, but the entire population of Sandwich Gulf Islands is roughly the population represented by 4 MPs in Ottawa from PEI. But so with the exception of one of the Prince Edward Island ridings, Sandwich Gulf Islands had the highest voter turnout in Canada at just under 75% in 2011. And that was extraordinary at the time. The national average voter turnout was 60%, when we were just about 75. And in 2015, when I was so hugely honored again to be re-elected, well, then we had a big increase in voter turnout across Canada. It went from 60% to 68%. And that voter turnout meant we were only in the top 6. But guess what? We had just under 80% voter turnout. So our voter turnout at the federal level is quite high compared to the national average. And although 43% isn't adequate, you think that's terrible. Where's our interest? Where the decisions are made that most affect our lives. Because the decisions that most affect our lives day to day rest with the municipal order of government. And yet that's where we see the lowest voter turnout. I was speaking recently at the annual meeting. I've been honored by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities even before I won a seat in the federal parliament, because I'm the federal leader of the Green Party. The FCM has been inviting me to speak to their annual meetings now for, I think, 10 years, at least, actually. And my work with FCM predates when I got into politics. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities is what I think of as a kind of a think tank, a policy shop. They come up with great ideas. And when I was executive director of Sierra Club of Canada, we were trying to think what we could do to create more on-the-ground examples. And this is so pathetic, because this is going back to 1997, that we were looking at how we could do more on climate change. And where was there the creativity and the flexibility to take up the challenge and move on it right away? And we were working with a Toronto City Councillor named Dan Leckie. You may, if you go to Toronto someday, when you're near the CBC building, you may see Dan Leckie Way, a small street named in his honor, because he died tragically not long after I was working with him on this project. But Dan Leckie and Sierra Club climate staffer at the time, Louise Camo, and I went in to meet with the Minister of Finance, Paul Martin, and persuaded him to take a chunk of money and put it in a revolving fund that municipalities could use. Now, the point of the story is really that municipalities were able to be immediately effective with the money. What they created was partners in climate protection. They then hired Louise away from me, so she worked at FCM. That wasn't so great, but it was a good idea because it's a project. She understood the point of it. And what municipalities are able to do that other levels of government or orders of government aren't able to do quite as rapidly is make decisions and see with a kind of an entrepreneurial instinct how it's going to advance the bottom line for the town or village or city. So they saw right away, the country's mayors looked at partners in climate protection. And if they weren't interested in climate before, when they saw that they could get a substantial interest-free loan to upgrade the town hall, build a new swimming pool with a fraction of the energy required to heat and cool the building, all of those things were proven out really fast. And the program continues to this day because that's the beauty of a revolving fund. As soon as the investments in energy efficiency paid for themselves, the money went back into the fund. So it was an interest-free loan and repayable usually within 5 to 6 years. The money would go back, so the fund continues. Well, from that early experience of working with the country's mayors and councils, I've been looking at the structural issue of how difficult it is for municipalities. Because of every tax dollar collected in Canada, we pay taxes locally, provincially, and federally, but of every tax dollar collected in Canada, only 8 cents goes to the local order of government. But that's the order of government that has to provide us with our water, a lot of our transportation, our composting and recycling and garbage removal, and all manner of snow, and not so much a big deal here, snow clearing. It mattered in Toronto, remember when they had to call in the army. It matters. Sometimes say that we know if the federal government went on strike, how would we know? I mean, would we be up in arms when we didn't get the requirement to pay our income tax? Would we really notice if, for most of us, day to day, the order of government that makes the biggest difference in our life is the local order of government. So we should be, instinctively one would think, voting in higher numbers when it comes to electing our local government. But it's the reverse. So you see that it makes, for voter turnout to go up, I in general make the case that higher voter turnout creates better government. Greater citizen engagement creates better government. Citizens create better government. Better government doesn't occur, frankly. Good government doesn't happen without significant citizen engagement, and not just during elections. The engagement, I'm really grateful for people who show up at my town hall meetings. So here's a plug, the usual round of 8 to 9 meetings will happen again between Labor Day and mid-September when Parliament resumes. And then again, I do another round of meetings in January. The engagement there informs me for the issues I should be working on in Ottawa. I mean, yes, I have the mail-in forms that come with the newsletters, and those are very helpful. But the interaction with voters at town hall meetings is enormously helpful to me. So when we look at voter turnout and what can create higher levels of voter turnout, a lot of it is local news coverage. We're lucky that we have a local newspaper, but we no longer have across Canada the strength in our news media that we used to. And as journalism about local issues declines, when I was growing up in Cape Breton and we had a Sydney Cape Breton supper time news. 6 o'clock at night you got the CBC supper time news, and it was local news. Now we don't. We have very little access to the news about what's going on in our communities. I was talking to someone recently. I was in Guelph campaigning for Mike Schreiner, who was recently elected to Queen's Park, who's the leader of the Green Party of Ontario. But I was talking to a reporter with one of the big national networks, commercial networks, and he said, I have to get you on this video feed, and I have to do a written story, because we have to do all the different platforms. And I said, how is it going for you, or at least you? He said, well, ever since they cut, and I missed this, I don't know how I missed it, they cut all coverage of local athletics. Now, you may think that is a kind of a stretch to local government, but when news media cuts the coverage of local athletics, fewer and fewer people are going to be reading the papers, and our news media is shrinking in its scope. And as we shrink what we cover locally, that also contributes to lower voter turnout. One of my favorite journalist friends in Ottawa, because I really respect her, is Susan Delacourt. And in her research for her book, Shopping for Votes, she found a study that every time a provincial newspaper, like the Times Colonist or the Vancouver Sun, every time they eliminate the position, because it seems redundant when you're cutting corners all the time, to have a Vancouver Sun Ottawa Bureau reporter. When they cut the Ottawa Bureau reporter for a provincial daily, voter turnout tends to go down the next election. So this was a study done by an academic that looked right across Canada and found this as an empirical reality. So I look at what makes for a healthy democracy, and one piece that's really a challenge right now is strength of local media. So yes, I think the Saanich News, and they do once a week we do get more coverage of local news than some other communities. But the reality is it's nothing like what we used to have when you had more reporters covering every single town and city council meeting. So a group like Sydney Community Association plays a really important role in expanding the network of people paying attention to what happens in our local town council meetings. Because land use planning, of course, is local, and in that cluster of really important day-to-day issues that affect us all, land use planning is key. But I want, if you permit me, to turn my attention to what really makes a healthy democracy, and we have a chance as British Columbians, so I'm taking us out of the question around municipal politics. Although I will say about municipal politics that one reason that I think municipal politics can work better than what we see happening in the federal parliament or in a provincial legislature is the absence of political parties in most municipalities. I think that's actually a very good thing, because one of the reasons that our voting system at the federal level and provincial level of first past the post is so distorting of the public will is that increasingly people are voting for a party brand and not necessarily the individual person. Whereas when we vote municipally, we vote for the person we trust. We know that person, and we're not voting by party brand. And it makes a really big difference when a voting system can reflect what the public really wanted. So I'd say in municipal politics, Vancouver's a bit of an exception because it does have parties, but for most municipalities across Canada, we don't. And this may sound strange coming from the leader of a federal political party, but if we could do away with all political parties, I think our democracy would be much, much healthier. And then looking at the federal level and the provincial level, which is why I wanted to mention the referendum we have coming up this fall, it's really important that we get high levels of voter participation in that referendum. I'm sure you all know it's going to be a mail-in ballot. We can start voting October 22nd. Information will be coming out soon from BC elections as to what the nature of the questions will mean to us. But when you look at voter turnout and first past the post, it accentuates the distortions of first past the post when we have low voter turnout. So I just used the Ontario election as an example. I was mentioned earlier, Jocelyn mentioned I'm taking off for Toronto straight from this meeting because for the Toronto Pride Parade tomorrow. It'll feel a little bit different there because the last number of years that I've participated in the Toronto Pride Parade, the Premier's been there. I don't think the Premier Designate's going to be there, but maybe he'll surprise us. I think he'll be full of surprises. Maybe we'll get some good ones. But just looking at this dispassionately, not the Ontario election voter turnout, and I just mentioned earlier in my talk, that the last election federally in Canada had 68% voter turnout. That's not very good in my view. It's better. In the early 1990s, we were over 70% voter turnout. It's been declining. It went up again in 2015 from 60% voter turnout to 68. I'd like to see the same kind of voter. I'd like to see Sandwich Gulf Islands do better than 80%. My colleague, Peter Bevan Baker, who's the leader of the Green Party of Prince Edward Island, I mentioned Prince Edward Island votes a lot. The voter turnout in Peter's riding was 93%. So we can always do better. We're not going to rest on our laurels with 80% voter turnout in Sandwich Gulf Islands. But in Ontario, with such critical issues at play, they had 58% voter turnout on June 7th. So of the 58% of the Ontarians who voted, 40% chose a Conservative candidate. But in our system of government, unlike in the U.S., and thank goodness in the U.S. they have separation of powers, but in Canada, given the current occupant of the White House, but in Canada, our Prime Minister, in a majority, with a majority of the seats, it's referred to as a majority government, controls both the executive, which the U.S. President controls, and the legislative, which the U.S. President does not. So you basically get 100% of the power if you're a premier or a prime minister with a majority of the seats. But if you're, yes, I know, it's distressing. And we have babies in Parliament these days, at least you heard that story, I won't go on that. But the majority of the seats is virtually always secured with a minority of public support in terms of those who voted. So 40% of those who voted chose a Conservative candidate in Ontario. But that's about 23% of the voting population, because only 58% of Ontarians voted. I mean, it was extraordinary in Alberta when Rachel Notley won, and people reported that's the highest voter turnout they've had in 40 years. It's a huge voter turnout, 58%. When the public gets discouraged with the choices and they think it doesn't matter how I vote, we know that the such and such party always wins, it reduces voter turnout. When you have a system of voting that makes sure your vote will count, and this is again empirical research, I'm going to cite now a book called Patterns of Democracy. And I know Sandwich Gulf Islands residents are good at research and serious about figuring issues out. If you want to answer any question you have about, do I really want to get rid of first past the post for British Columbia, or are there risks in proportional representation? Answering those questions I think this is the single most important book among many, because the professor who wrote it, Arndt Liebhardt, who was a Dutch emigre to the U.S. and professor emeritus from Stanford University, his book, Patterns of Democracy, looks at over 60 countries over a 40-year period and crunches all the numbers. So looking at the majority of modern democracies, by the way, use some form of proportional representation. The countries that use first past the post are the minority, and they're really only the countries that descended from Queen Victoria. So the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth nations are still using a system that involves a horse racing analogy, first past the post. And the jockey club in the UK got rid of first past the post as a rule in the 1880s, but I'm digressing. So it wasn't considered a good rule for horses, but we still use it in our federal elections in most of the Commonwealth. New Zealand's gotten rid of it. Australia has tweaked it slightly, but still uses a majoritarian system. But what Professor Liebhardt found was, across the board, countries that use PR have higher voter turnout than countries that don't. So that's the first thing. You can take that to the bank. Countries that use proportional representation have more civic engagement. The reason is obvious. I've answered the question before I asked it. If you know your vote's going to count, you're more likely to exercise your vote than if you think it won't make any difference. So voting turnout really matters, and proportional representation gives us higher voter turnout. I'm not going to rant on about PR. I'll just say if you want to dig into Professor Liebhardt's book, you'll also find the following attributes of proportional representation voting. More women are elected, more minority and culturally diverse representation in Parliament occurs, and also some surprises. More stable government occurs under PR. So longer times between elections. Passage of budgets by consensus happens more in PR. And that also, stricter environmental regulations and better economic performance. So those are all attributes of the PR system. And there are various kinds. As we know, when we look at our ballot, we're going to be given a couple of options. But any of the options are better than the current system. Because in a time when so-called populism is on the rise, when you get figures like Trump or Ford or, some of the scarier ones in Europe, but you look at that and you think, we wouldn't want someone like that to become prime minister or premier unless they actually have the majority of public support. I mean, you can't stop someone being elected who is distressing if the majority of voters in a democracy want those policies. What's really dangerous is when the majority of voters specifically don't want those policies, but the voting system delivers a big landslide win. I mean, Doug Ford's win was referred to as a landslide because he got 71 seats compared to the NDP's 40. If you look at the popular vote, there was a very narrow difference, 5-6 percentage points in popular public opinion and this actual voting between the two parties. I mean, clearly, and Kathleen Wynne's party was much less decimated than it appeared to be if you look at the popular vote. So getting a voting system that allows the popular vote to be reflected in the parliament or legislature you get would make a big difference. Municipally, the biggest change we need for fairer government is to bring to the municipal level the changes that have been made now federally and provincially to get money out of politics, to make sure that donations can't be accepted at the local government level. And now I speak right across all of Canada. I'm not making any comments about Sydney, but right across Canada, we've made really big strides. British Columbia, before the last election, was, through many exposés in the national press, including in the New York Times, looking at BC's, Wild West, we refer to, of, you could accept money from offshore oil and gas conglomerates to a provincial coffer. I mean, there were basically no campaign finance rules at all. And of course, on the other side of the spectrum, you could accept big money from largely trade unions. And now I think that the changes that have been made are really good to get most of the, you never can fix the system completely if someone wants to figure out a way to collect money on the margins in ways that offend the spirit of the law. But I think the law is honored by the letter of the law federally and now provincially. And that's one area for citizen engagement looking forward. So I know I promised there'd be time for questions, and I don't have to run exactly at 10:45, but I'll let you know now. I'm beginning to wrap up so you can think of any questions you might have. But I want to thank you all for being here, because a community association can't exist in name only. It needs a community. And by being here this morning for an AGM, you're showing your commitment to where we live. I wish I could stay longer and be more useful locally. My work as a federal member of parliament is the most, I've done a lot of different kinds of jobs in my life. I've never felt that anything I was doing was as important as trying to be your voice in the federal parliament and represent the concerns of this extraordinary community. The degree of community engagement and citizen engagement is what makes it possible for any good things to happen in this country. It takes a lot of citizen engagement on any issue. It's always been the case. Gus Speth, who's now the head of the Yale University Department of Environment, but he used to be the head of the United Nations Development Program. He has a way with words. He used to say, politicians ride the waves, but citizen groups make them. So keep on making the waves. I'll try to get a surfboard that lets me keep up, although the idea of being on a surfboard is pretty absurd. But I do try to keep up with the citizens of Saanich Gulf Islands. I do try to raise the issues that are on your minds, and I do support and celebrate the work that you're doing here in representing and bringing forward the concerns that you have to the wonderful people who donate so much of their time in local government. It really matters. So on that note, thank you for being here today for a wonderful meeting of the Sydney Community Association. Good luck in voting, and thank you so much for your commitment to this wonderful town, because I love living in Sydney. I'm never going to live anywhere else. I know I love all other parts of my riding, but I love Sydney, and thank you so much for protecting me.
Parliament, Elizabeth is not allowed to accept gifts.
Oh, yes, I am. I just have to declare them, like Justin and the sunglasses from Wayne Clothing. I haven't had that problem, but Wayne's never given me any sunglasses.
This is $10 worth of tea called Sydney Sunrise from Janet's Teas.
Oh, wow.
And a small blue heron tile from Village Gallery, both on Beacon Street. Thank you very much.